The neighborhood of Willow Creek was the embodiment of suburban bliss. Lawns were perfectly manicured, flower beds burst with color, and children played freely in the streets. Behind the picturesque exterior, however, the residents of Willow Creek carried with them their own unspoken tensions and quiet prejudices. Among them was Margaret Preston, a white woman in her late 40s, who prided herself on keeping the neighborhood in pristine condition. For now her eyes too noticed at her new neighbor David Carter, a reserved black man in his late 30s. David had recently moved into Willow Creek, occupying a modest but beautiful home near the end of the cul-de-sac. Just a few days after David moved in, she got annoyed of the sign staked in David's yard, required by the city for his solar panel installation. The sight of it sparked a surge of frustration. So she decided to take action as believed that she tries to help community. But this action will change her life forever. Before we dive into the twists and turns of this story, hit that like button and comment. Where in the world are you listening to this jaw-dropping story? Margaret Preston had lived in Willow Creek for nearly 15 years and saw herself as the unofficial gatekeeper of its perfection. She loved this neighborhood, not just for its aesthetics, but for the sense of order it brought to her life. Margaret believed that maintaining this order required vigilance, and she was more than willing to step into that role. Known among her neighbors as Mrs. Preston, Margaret was the president of the HOA 3 years running, and even though she had stepped down the year prior, her influence lingered. If there was a fence that needed painting, a lawn that was overgrown, or a car parked slightly askew, Margaret made it her business to address the issue. She considered herself the custodian of Willow Creek's charm, and most neighbors, while annoyed at times, tolerated her meddling because they knew she meant well, or so they told themselves. Margaret thrived in this environment. She had worked hard to build her life in Willow Creek and felt that every resident should do the same. Divorced and living alone, she spent her days volunteering at the local community center and organizing neighborhood events, from summer barbecues to the annual Christmas light competition. In her mind, she wasn't just a neighbor. She was the glue that held Willow Creek together. Her love for structure and order, however, often bled into her interactions with others. Margaret wasn't unkind, but she had a way of making her disapproval known through veiled comments and sharp glances. If she felt someone wasn't contributing to the community's standards, she would politely let them know. Most of her neighbors had learned to smile, nod, and move on, brushing off her comments as the quirks of an over-involved busybody. But there was no denying that Margaret had a way of making people feel like they were under a microscope. When David Carter moved into the neighborhood, Margaret was among the first to notice. She always kept an eye on her surroundings, and the sight of a new face, especially one unfamiliar to her, piqued her interest. David arrived on a sunny Saturday morning, driving a sleek black electric car and followed by a moving truck. From the window of her home, Margaret observed him carefully, her gaze flicking over his appearance, his car, and the moving crew unloading box after box. He was tall, with an air of quiet confidence, dressed casually in jeans and a fitted t-shirt. To Margaret, he didn't fit the mold of Willow Creek's typical resident. He was young, for one thing, probably late 30s, she guessed, and he moved with a sense of purpose that Margaret found both intriguing and slightly unsettling. Who is he? Margaret wondered aloud to herself, sipping her morning coffee as she watched from behind her curtains. She quickly made a mental note to introduce herself once he was settled in, as any good neighbor would. That afternoon, Margaret took her dog for a walk, making sure to pass by David's house. She glanced at the truck still parked in the driveway, noting the lack of landscaping and the slightly faded paint on the shutters. She muttered under her breath, already forming an opinion about her new neighbor. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret found herself growing increasingly fixated on David Carter's home. At first, her attention was casual, even well-intentioned. She genuinely wanted to welcome him, to ensure that he felt included in the tight-knit Willow Creek community. But with every passing day, Margaret's unease grew. It wasn't just the slightly overgrown lawn or the occasional untidy corner of David's yard. It was his demeanor, quiet, reserved, and uninterested in the social fabric that Margaret held so dear. To her, Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a statement. It represented unity, order, and pride. And in her eyes, David was failing to meet those standards. One morning, as Margaret watered the flowers in her front yard, she noticed David backing his sleek electric car out of the driveway. He gave her a polite nod as he passed, but Margaret barely acknowledged him. Instead, she watched the car disappear down the street, her thoughts racing. "Doesn't even wave properly," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "He's not exactly trying to fit in, is he?" Margaret wasn't alone in her observations. In the weeks since David's arrival, his presence had become a topic of quiet conversation among the neighbors. At book club meetings and casual morning walks, his name came up more and more frequently. "He's so quiet," one neighbor commented. "I've barely seen him since he moved in." "Did you notice his shutters?" another chimed in. "The paint's peeling. That's not very Willow Creek." Margaret listened to these remarks with a mix of satisfaction and validation. She wasn't the only one concerned. But while others were content to gossip from the sidelines, Margaret felt compelled to act. "We need to set a standard," she declared one afternoon during a coffee gathering with a few neighbors. "If we let one house slip, the whole neighborhood will follow. It starts small, you know? A weed here, an unpainted shutter there, and before you know it, the property values are dropping." Carol, who had grown weary of Margaret's relentless focus on David, tried to push back. "Come on, Margaret. He's new. Give him some time to settle in." But Margaret was undeterred. "It's not about time, Carol. It's about effort. If he wants to live here, he needs to show that he cares." The tipping point came when David installed solar panels on the roof of his home. It was a quiet project, handled professionally over the course of a single day, but Margaret noticed immediately. She was out for her evening walk when she saw the workers finishing up, the sleek black panels gleaming in the fading sunlight. Margaret stopped in her tracks, her mouth tightening into a thin line. Solar panels were not against HOA rules, but they were unusual in Willow Creek. Most residents prioritized aesthetics over functionality, and Margaret couldn't help but see the panels as an affront to the neighborhood's carefully cultivated image. The next morning, as she walked past David's house, she spotted a small permit sign staked neatly in his yard, indicating city approval for the installation. It was a simple, temporary sign, but to Margaret, it felt like a declaration of defiance. She hurried home, her mind racing with thoughts of how to address the issue. Should she bring it up at the next HOA meeting? Write a letter? Or maybe, she thought, there was a more direct way to handle the problem. That evening, as Margaret sat on her porch, sipping her tea and staring at David's house, a plan began to take shape in her mind. The sign was the problem, she decided. It was an eyesore, a reminder of something that didn't belong. If it were gone, maybe the panels themselves would feel less permanent. "It's just a sign," she told herself, justifying her brewing plan. "No one will miss it." Under the cover of darkness, Margaret slipped on her sneakers and walked briskly to David's house. The street was quiet, and the glow of porch lights cast long shadows across the yards. She approached the sign, her heart pounding, and glanced around to ensure no one was watching. With one swift motion, she yanked the sign out of the ground. For a moment, she hesitated, clutching the sign in her hands. A small voice in her head warned her to stop, to leave it where it was and go home. But Margaret ignored it, marching back to her house and tossing the sign into her trash bin. As she closed the lid, she felt a fleeting sense of satisfaction. She had taken a stand, done what she thought was best for the neighborhood. But as she stood in the quiet of her garage, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite shake. The next day, David returned home from work and immediately noticed the absence of the sign. He frowned, scanning the yard and the street for any sign of it. It wasn't a significant loss, but it was strange. Permits were rarely touched, let alone removed entirely. He pulled out his phone and checked the footage from his security cameras. The sight of Margaret sneaking onto his property made him pause. He watched as she pulled the sign from the ground and walked briskly back to her house, her movements purposeful and unhesitating. David sighed, a mixture of frustration and disappointment washing over him. He had seen this kind of behavior before, subtle but insidious, and he had hoped Willow Creek would be different. Still, he wasn't one to react impulsively. Instead, he decided to handle the situation carefully. David made a note to bring up the incident at the next HOA meeting. He didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but he also couldn't let this slide. Respecting boundaries was a cornerstone of any good community, and it was clear that Margaret needed a reminder. Margaret woke up the morning after her late-night mission, feeling a sense of accomplishment. She had removed the problem, she thought, and brought the neighborhood one step closer to maintaining its pristine image. She went about her day with an air of satisfaction, convinced she had done what was necessary for the greater good. As she walked her dog past David's house that afternoon, she noticed him standing in his driveway, his hands on his hips, looking around his yard. Margaret slowed her pace, curious about his reaction. David spotted her and gave a polite wave, his expression unreadable. Margaret forced a smile and returned the wave, quickening her pace as she moved past his house. Probably wondering where his little sign went, she muttered under her breath, a smirk tugging at her lips. To her, the situation was already resolved, a minor act of intervention that required no further attention. She had no idea that David was already several steps ahead. Inside his home, David sat at his dining table, staring at his phone screen. The footage from his security camera played on a loop, showing Margaret sneaking onto his property and removing the permit sign. He shook his head, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. David had dealt with situations like this before. As a black man and property owner, he was no stranger to having his presence questioned in predominantly white spaces. But this incident felt different. It wasn't just about a sign. It was about the principle. Margaret's actions weren't just invasive. They were emblematic of a deeper issue, one that David couldn't ignore. He debated whether to confront Margaret directly but decided against it. A private conversation might escalate into a personal conflict, and David wanted a resolution that emphasized accountability, not animosity. Instead, he decided to bring the matter to the HOA meeting scheduled for the following evening. The Willow Creek HOA meetings were usually mundane affairs, filled with discussions about lawn care guidelines and community event planning. But as the members gathered in the community center that evening, a subtle tension hung in the air. Word had already spread that David planned to address an incident, though no one knew the specifics. Margaret arrived at the meeting feeling confident. She had brought a notebook filled with her usual HOA concerns, littering near the park, noisy teenagers down the street. But as she took her seat, she couldn't ignore the whispers among the attendees. People kept glancing at David, who sat calmly at the far end of the room. When the meeting began, Margaret listened half-heartedly as the HOA president reviewed the agenda. But her attention snapped into focus when David raised his hand to speak. "Thank you," David began, his voice steady but firm. "I want to bring up an issue that occurred on my property earlier this week. I have reason to believe that someone removed a permit sign from my yard without my consent." A murmur spread through the room. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. She kept her face neutral, hoping no one would connect her to the incident. David continued, "I installed solar panels on my roof, which required city approval. As part of that process, I was required to display a permit sign in my yard. That sign was removed and discarded without my permission. I have security footage of the incident." The room fell silent. All eyes were now on David, who calmly pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. He pressed play, and the footage began to play on the screen. Margaret's face, unmistakable in the glow of the streetlights, filled the room. Gasps rippled through the attendees. Margaret felt her face flush with heat as she gripped the edges of her notebook. She glanced around, desperate for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. When the footage ended, David looked directly at Margaret. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, "but I believe we need to have a discussion about respecting each other's property and boundaries." The HOA president turned to Margaret, her expression a mix of shock and disappointment. "Margaret," she said, her tone cautious but firm, "do you have anything to say about this?" Margaret opened her mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. She scrambled to find a defense, her mind racing. Finally, she said, I thought the sign was against the HOA guidelines. I was only trying to maintain the neighborhood's standards." David raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing the president to respond. "The sign was a permit," the president said. "It was temporary and fully compliant with both city and HOA regulations. Margaret, you had no right to remove it." Margaret fidgeted in her seat, her confidence draining with every word. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said weakly. "I thought I was doing the right thing." David leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "The issue isn't just about the sign, Margaret. It's about respect. If you had concerns, you could have talked to me or brought it up with the HOA. Instead, you trespassed on my property and destroyed something that wasn't yours. That's not how neighbors should treat each other." The room fell silent again, the weight of David's words hanging heavily in the air. Margaret stared at the table, unable to meet his gaze. The HOA president addressed the group. "This behavior is unacceptable and violates our community guidelines. Margaret, you will receive a formal warning, and any further actions like this will result in fines or other penalties. Additionally, you'll be required to apologize to David and replace the sign." Margaret nodded stiffly, her face pale. "I understand," she murmured, her voice barely audible. David nodded as well, though his expression remained neutral. "Thank you," he said. "I just want to ensure that this doesn't happen again." The meeting moved on, but the tension lingered. Margaret sat in silence for the rest of the evening, feeling the weight of her neighbor's judgment. As she walked home afterward, she couldn't shake the sense that her carefully cultivated image in the neighborhood had been irrevocably tarnished. The night after the HOA meeting, Margaret sat alone in her living room, nursing a glass of wine and staring blankly at the muted television. The events of the meeting played over and over in her mind. She could still hear the gasps of her neighbors as the security footage played and feel their judgmental stares as David's calm words laid bare the inappropriateness of her actions. Margaret had always prided herself on her reputation in Willow Creek. She was the one who organized block parties, ensured neighborhood standards were met, and maintained order when others let things slip. But now, for the first time, she felt like an outsider in the very community she had worked so hard to preserve. When she walked her dog the next morning, she noticed how her neighbors avoided her. People who used to greet her warmly now crossed the street to avoid interaction. Carol, her longtime friend and confidant, gave her a brief, awkward wave from her driveway but made no effort to chat. Margaret's chest tightened as she realized how isolated she had become in just a matter of days. Margaret spent the next few days replaying the incident in her mind, trying to justify her actions to herself. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she muttered under her breath. But even as she said it, the words rang hollow. Deep down, she knew there had been no justification for what she had done. Her discomfort grew when Carol stopped by later that week. Margaret, eager for some semblance of normalcy, invited her in and offered her a cup of tea. But the conversation quickly turned to the HOA meeting. "Margaret," Carol began hesitantly, "I wanted to check in on you. I know the meeting was a lot." Margaret sighed, setting down her tea. "It was humiliating, Carol. Everyone looked at me like I was some kind of criminal." Carol hesitated before responding. "I think people were just surprised. You've always been such a stickler for rules, and this, well, it didn't feel like you." Margaret frowned. "I was trying to do the right thing. That sign was ruining the neighborhood's look." Carol gave her a pointed look. "Margaret, it was a permit. It wasn't hurting anyone. And you went onto his property without asking. That's not how you've ever handled things before." The words stung, but Margaret knew Carol was right. She had let her frustration, and, if she was honest with herself, her assumptions about David, cloud her judgment. In the days following Carol's visit, Margaret began hearing more about David from other neighbors. She learned that he wasn't just another resident. He was a successful real estate investor who owned several homes in the neighborhood. One of those homes was Carol's rental property. When Margaret first heard this, her mouth fell open in shock. "Wait, he owns your house?" she asked Carol when they spoke again. Carol nodded. "He's been my landlord for years. He's fair, professional, and always willing to help." Honestly, Margaret, you couldn't ask for a better neighbor. The revelation hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She had spent weeks questioning how David could afford to live in Willow Creek, assuming he was out of place, when in reality, he had been contributing to the neighborhood's success all along. For the first time, Margaret began to see the depth of her error. She hadn't just acted impulsively, she had acted out of prejudice. She had let her assumptions about David's background and his place in the neighborhood drive her actions, and now she was paying the price. One evening, as Margaret sat on her back porch, the weight of her actions finally became unbearable. She couldn't deny it any longer. She had been wrong. Her actions weren't just a violation of community rules. They were a violation of the very values she claimed to uphold: respect, fairness, and neighborliness. She had abandoned all of them in her quest to enforce her own narrow vision of what Willow Creek should be. With a deep breath, Margaret pulled out a notepad and pen and began to write. The words came slowly at first, but as she wrote, the floodgates opened. She admitted to herself, and to David in the letter, that her actions had been wrong and fueled by unfounded assumptions. She apologized for trespassing, for removing his sign, and for failing to treat him with the respect he deserved. By the time she finished, tears blurred her vision. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, along with a gift card to a local hardware store as a gesture of goodwill. The next morning, she drove to a nearby store to purchase a replacement permit sign, identical to the one she had destroyed. Margaret stood on David's porch later that afternoon, clutching the letter and the replacement sign in her trembling hands. Her heart pounded as she raised her fist to knock on the door. For a moment, she considered turning back, but she forced herself to stay. This was her mess, and she needed to fix it. When the door opened, David stood there, his expression calm but curious. "Margaret," he said evenly, "what can I do for you?" Margaret took a deep breath, holding out the letter and the sign. "Mr. Carter, I want to apologize," she began, her voice trembling. "I was completely out of line. I destroyed your property, and I let my assumptions get the better of me. It was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry." David studied her for a long moment before taking the items from her hands. He glanced at the letter and then back at Margaret. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said finally. "I appreciate the apology." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I also brought a replacement sign," she said, motioning to the sign she held. "I hope this can start to make up for what I did." David nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Margaret. That's a good first step." As Margaret walked back to her house, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The apology didn't erase her actions, but it was a start. For the first time, she felt hopeful, not just about repairing her relationship with David, but about becoming a better neighbor and person. In the days following her apology to David, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Though David had graciously accepted her apology, she knew that words alone weren't enough to repair the damage she had caused. If she wanted to regain her standing in the neighborhood, and more importantly, her self-respect, she needed to follow through with meaningful actions. Margaret decided to go beyond simply replacing the permit sign. She reached out to David with an offer to assist him in any way she could. "If there's anything you need help with around the house or the neighborhood," she said one afternoon as they crossed paths near their mailboxes, "please let me know. I'd like to make amends." David smiled politely. "I appreciate that, Margaret. But honestly, I think the best way to move forward is to focus on making this neighborhood a better place for everyone. Maybe you could help with the community project I'm organizing." Margaret tilted her head. "Community project?" David explained that he was spearheading an initiative to revitalize the neighborhood park, which had fallen into disrepair over the years. "It's something I've been wanting to do for a while," he said. "The park could use new benches, better lighting, and some fresh landscaping. It's a place where families gather, and I think it deserves more attention." Margaret immediately volunteered to help. "I'd love to be involved," she said, her voice earnest. "Let me know what I can do." The following weekend, Margaret arrived at the park bright and early, armed with gardening gloves, tools, and a renewed sense of purpose. To her surprise, several other neighbors had joined the effort, including Carol, the Larkins from down the street, and even a few teenagers from the neighborhood. David stood at the center of the group, coordinating tasks with a calm authority that impressed Margaret. "Thank you all for coming," he said as he handed out assignments. "This park belongs to all of us, and together we can make it something special." Margaret found herself assigned to a landscaping crew, tasked with weeding flower beds and planting new shrubs along the park's edges. As she worked alongside Carol and the Larkins, she began to notice a shift in the way her neighbors interacted with her. While there was still some hesitancy in their smiles, The ice was beginning to thaw. During a break, Margaret watched as David installed a new park bench with the help of a young couple. She marveled at how effortlessly he brought people together, his quiet leadership inspiring a sense of unity that had been missing from Willow Creek. It dawned on her how wrong she had been about him. David wasn't just a passive member of the community. He was an active force for good. Her assumptions about him, rooted in her own biases, had blinded her to the positive impact he was already making. Margaret felt a pang of guilt, but also a glimmer of hope. She realized that it wasn't too late to be part of that change, to contribute to the sense of unity David was fostering. As the group resumed work, Margaret approached David cautiously. "You've done an amazing job organizing this," she said, her tone genuine. "I never realized how much the park meant to the neighborhood." David smiled, wiping his hands on a towel. "Thank you, Margaret. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. This park is where families come to connect, where kids make memories. It should be a space everyone can be proud of." Margaret nodded. "I'd like to contribute more. If you need anything, fundraising, organizing volunteers, please let me know." David regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you." Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into the park revitalization project with a zeal that surprised even herself. She organized bake sales to raise funds for new playground equipment, enlisted volunteers from other parts of the neighborhood, and even convinced the HOA to match the donations raised by the community. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors who had once avoided her began to warm up, their smiles less guarded, their greetings more sincere. Carol, who had been hesitant to rekindle their friendship, invited Margaret over for coffee one morning. "You've really turned things around," Carol said, a note of admiration in her voice. "It's good to see you so involved." Margaret smiled, though she still felt the weight of her earlier mistakes. "I realized I've been looking at things the wrong way," she admitted. "It's not about controlling the neighborhood. It's about building it up, making it a better place for everyone." Carol raised her mug in a toast. "Here's to a better Willow Creek." As the park project neared completion, the community gathered for a ribbon-cutting ceremony to celebrate their hard work. New benches, freshly planted flowers, and a brand-new playground stood as a testament to their collective effort. Margaret felt a swell of pride as she looked around at the crowd, seeing neighbors laughing and chatting, children racing across the grass, and families snapping photos in front of the new equipment. David stood at the front of the group, holding a pair of oversized scissors for the ribbon cutting. "Before we officially open the park," he said, addressing the crowd, "I just want to thank everyone who contributed to this project. This was a team effort, and it's a reminder of what we can achieve when we work together." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the group before landing on Margaret. "I'd also like to recognize Margaret Preston. Her dedication to this project was instrumental in bringing it to life." "Margaret, thank you for your hard work." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Margaret's cheeks flushed as she stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Thank you, David," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But really, it's all of us. This park belongs to the whole neighborhood, and I'm just glad I could be part of it." As the ribbon was cut and the crowd cheered, Margaret felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, she wasn't just enforcing her vision of what Willow Creek should be, she was contributing to what it could become. In the weeks that followed, Margaret continued to make an effort to mend her relationships within the community. She greeted neighbors with a genuine warmth, offered to help where she could, and even joined David in brainstorming other ways to improve the neighborhood. Slowly but surely, the scars left by her earlier actions began to heal. David, too, noticed the change in Margaret. One afternoon, as they stood by the park watching children play, he turned to her and said, "You know, Margaret, I wasn't sure what to think after everything that happened. But I have to say, I respect how you've turned things around." Margaret smiled, her gaze fixed on the playground. "I had a lot to learn," she admitted, "but I'm glad I did. And I'm glad you gave me a chance to make things right." David nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park, Margaret felt a sense of peace. She had made mistakes, big ones, but she had also grown from them. And in doing so, she had found a way to be part of something bigger than herself. Willow Creek, once a place defined by its rigid standards and quiet tensions, began to shift into something more inclusive. The park stood as a symbol of what the community could achieve when it came together, and Margaret's transformation became a quiet inspiration for others. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was better, more connected, more understanding, and more united. And for Margaret, that was more than enough. Thank you so much for being here with us. If you like this story, don't forget to like and share to your friends. And we will see you in the next video.